All right, guys, welcome back to Falcon Central Radio, part of the Pro Football Central Radio Network. I am one of your hosts, Aaron Freeman, joined as usual by my co-host Matt Caroly. Tonight, we are joined by none other than the Falcoholics, David Walker, aka DW. You guys know him from his alcoholism and his snark on Twitter. But welcome to the show, DW. It's
Thanks,
the end
guys.
of 2019, and last show of the year, but kind of the first show of 2020 as well. So welcome to the show, DW.
Thanks for having me on.
So guys, if you tuned in to get our takes on the Week 17 win over the Tampa Bay Buccaneers, I'm sorry to disappoint you, but that's not really what this show is going to be about. As the regular listeners know from listening to and watching last week's show, we were going to talk about the coaching changes that we thought were going to happen. But then we had some news on Friday that there will be no changes. We got confirmation earlier today from Dan Quinn that at least in terms of the coordinators, there will be no changes. We'll have to sort of see if maybe some of the assistants go. But for those of you guys that have been living under a rock, or those of you that just need a brief refresher on what exactly we're talking about, on Friday, Falcons owner Arthur Blank announced that Thomas Dimitroff, the Falcons general manager, and Dan Quinn, their head coach, would be brought back for the 2019 season. Rich McKay, who's basically spent the last decade plus on the business side of things, trying to get the stadium up and running for these last several years and sort of smoothing that transition with Mercedes-Benz, will now be back as sort of part of the football decision-making process. According to Blank, Quinn and Dimitroff will be sort of reporting directly to McKay, or at least he'll be assisting them in terms of making, three heads are better than two, I guess, is the idea that Blank has. Raheem Morris, who's been sort of the acting defensive coordinator for the Falcons the last couple of weeks, sharing those duties with linebackers coach Jeff Ulbrich. Morris will be back officially in sort of the permanent gig as the defensive coordinator in 2020. And of course, Dan Quinn said on Friday that he is inclined to keeping Dirk Cutter, and despite the team's struggles in that Week 17 game on offense, he said again, reiterated on Monday, that he fully intends to keep Dirk Cutter as the team's offensive coordinator, as well as special teams coordinator Ben Katukwa will also be back in that role. So all of that to say, Matt, give me your takes.
Yeah, I mean, less than thrilled is probably putting it mildly. Aaron, you and I talked, throughout the season, kind of at the middle point. Kind of, we were looking ahead, that this was a done deal, foregone conclusion. No head coach has lived to tell the tale under the Arthur Blank regime. After missing two straight postseason appearances and lived to tell the tale. But Dan Quinn's going to be the first to do it, and you got to credit him. And I kind of credit a little bit his recruiting skills. We always talk about Dan Quinn being such a great recruiter, getting players and free agency to come and motivating these guys and the draft picks and, the brotherhood culture. So I kind of credit that for, his pitch to Arthur Blank. Obviously it helps when you beat two of the top NFC contenders in the back half of this season. But, I credit a lot to do with that. I mean, Dan Quinn, from those that watch and listen to him in his post-game press conferences and all that, and, throughout the weeks, you like what he has to say. Like, you want to do well for him. You want to run through a wall for him. But again, I thought, this regime, ran its course, 5 years, getting to the pinnacle, getting close to it. Typically there's that 5-year rule where, if you can't win it all with a head coach after 5 years, again, you have to kind of move on. And I thought that's where we were heading here. Now, I will say, again, I like where the defense is heading. I like, he made the right move by moving Raheem Morris to the defense side of the ball, but, he did it way too late. And that was one of the things that Dan Quinn did say, that he's kind of learned from this whole experience. So I do like where the defense is heading, and hopefully, the momentum of this can carry forward into 2020. But as, I noted on a previous show, I mean, really what's got me down about all this, and I'm sure it's gotten a lot of Falcons fans down, is the state of the offense and bringing back Dirk Cutter, which we have confirmation that that's going to be the case in 2020. And really the only hope and saving grace is that, Matt Ryan and the offense usually in year two of a particular coordinator, does better than year one. But I do think there's some very fundamental problems that all of us have kind of noted throughout the season with Dirk Cutter, as far as the lack of play action, the lack of aggressiveness, lack of pre-snap motion, never being able to orchestrate a successful run game. I don't know if any of that's going to change. I mean, you might see marginal upgrades in efficiency metrics and, points per game and all that. But I still think, the root of this problem, there's a fundamental problem with Dirk Cutter as offensive coordinator. So that's the sad part for me about all this, that we have to endure another season of that. And, we can only hope that, the offensive line continues to gel as the rookie right side continues to get more and more experience, and that'll help. But again, I think the ceiling is somewhat limited, with this regime in place on the offense side of the ball. But it is what it is, and we're going to have to, grow to accept it in 2020, unfortunately.
DW, what are your thoughts on this very subject?
Yeah, I think Dan Quinn, made a little bit of sense, purely from the standpoint of, being a coach that does a lot of things the right way. He came in and, certainly had a bigger focus on the development of younger players. We've seen that where he is, through his tenure, he's given guys like Ricardo Allen, who was discarded in the Smith regime, a chance to become a good starter, in my opinion. We've seen guys in the later rounds of the draft get opportunities that maybe they wouldn't have under other coaching staffs. So I understand that. I was actually somewhat happy with Raheem Morris being promoted to DC. I felt like that was a good move. It made a lot of sense. To Matt's point, you do sort of wonder from their own internal scouting, why didn't they make that move sooner? Why did they wait until 1-7 to start making changes, as opposed to, when you're 1-3, 1-4, why not make the change at that point? And I think that's a fair question. For Dirk Cutter, this is a horrible move. So I have a philosophy where coaching is concerned. There's three types of coaches. There's the coach that, the most common, which he will use the talent he's given. The rare type of coach is the kind that will elevate the talent that he's given. And those are exceptionally hard to find. I think Shanahan is a coach like that, where he'll take those guys, he'll take a great quarterback and make him elite, which is what we saw in 2016 with Matt Ryan. And then you have those coaches who will hold back talent. So the talent doesn't perform to the level that they're capable at. I think for Dirk Cutter, and we saw this, looking back, we saw this in 2012 through 2014 when he was here. If everything is going perfectly, full health, all guys are playing, they're healthy, he can run a top 10 offense. If he's got talent, if he's got an offensive line that's keeping the quarterback clean, he can do that. The minute anything goes off the rails, his offense falls apart. And I think that's what we saw this year. They had some rotation at the interior of the offensive line, and he just does not have an answer to overcome talent deficiencies or issues on the offense. And there was a stretch of time at the beginning of the season where I was convinced that he did not know Calvin Ridley existed. It felt like until Sanu was traded, he didn't realize that Ridley was an available option to him, which is incredibly infuriating. As you mentioned, he has never once established a running offense that has been worth a damn in the past 5 to 6 years. And the fact that the Falcons looked at that, they looked at the fact that Matt Ryan took 48 sacks this year, I believe it was,
yep.
So averaging 3 per game. And he's 34, he's going to be 35 next year. That's not something you want to do with an aging quarterback. The fact that, Dimitroff and Dan Quinn looked at that and said, that's good, we can live with that, it's mind blowing. It's a level of mediocrity, especially with the talent we've got. And we only have Ryan and Julio for just a few more years. If we're being realistic, Ryan is probably going to play to 38, 39. Julio probably has 2, maybe 3 years left. And we're about to take another year and give it to a guy who couldn't establish a running game, who doesn't believe in play action, who thinks pre-snap movement is anathema. This is arguably the absolute worst decision of the weekend. Actually, I would say inarguably. I can live with Quinn. I like Raheem. Dirk Cutter will hold this team back in 2020.
Yeah, and I think, also, you're betting on this staff pretty much, that this is the staff that's going to be able to win a Super Bowl with Matt Ryan and Julio Jones. Because if 2020 works, because this is an end all be all season. I thought 2019 was that, but obviously it's not. If this doesn't work out in 2020, you're talking about a new staff in 2021 with Matt Ryan at 36, Julio Jones at 32. Yep. Show me a precedent where a new staff can go in and take a 36-year-old quarterback, 32-year-old top wide receiver, and get them over the hump. So that's really another thing that depressed me this weekend about this decision to bring the staff back. Because again, we had said, Aaron, on the show that if Quinn was back, it was likely that he wasn't going to cut Dirk Cutter, just because I couldn't see him firing an offense coordinator in consecutive seasons. Now, even if it was the right thing to do, which it would have been, I just couldn't see it. And now, our worst fears have been confirmed. But that's another thing that gets me, is this is the staff that's going to have to get Matt Ryan the Super Bowl ring, in my opinion. Maybe you have a scenario, maybe, like Denver had with Peyton Manning when he was 37, 38, and it was built on the defense. But I think we're a long ways away from having a dominant defense. I do like what Raheem's going to bring, and hopefully some of this momentum carries forward. But I still think at best, this is maybe, a top 15 defense, not a top 10, definitely not a top 5. So, again, that is what it is. We've lived with that for a while. It's the fact that we have all this talent on offense, and we're not going to be able to maximize it with Dirk Cutter calling the shots.
Yeah, I agree with everything you guys said. Similar to DW, like it was never really about Dan Quinn with me in terms of wanting the team to make a change. Like I don't really have an issue for or against Dan Quinn. I like Dan Quinn, but it was really just kind of like, we have to fire Dan Quinn in order to get rid of Dirk Cutter.
Right.
We have to fire Dan Quinn in order to get a new offensive line coach and maybe steal Bill Callahan from the Redskins or something like that to try to upgrade that unit, because I really do think, Chris Morgan was always kind of a question mark. And it's been something that we've talked about on this podcast and this show over the course of the season. And the question was, can he develop young talent? And, Lindstrom and McGarry certainly had their moments, but it doesn't feel like they were well developed this year. It doesn't feel like, outside of maybe Matt Gano, you can ever really look at a player that came to Atlanta on the offensive line that got better than what they were prior to Atlanta. He can just sort of maintain the status quo. And that's, kind of similar to what DW was saying about Dirk Cutter in terms of how he gets the best out of his ability. And for me, you guys talk about sort of the future and how much time we have in the window and whatnot, and talk about sort of we're a couple of years away from the defense. And that was kind of my sort of motivating factor to why I kind of wanted to move on from Dan Quinn and the staff, was because I don't think there's a ton of time left. And I think you kind of have to build towards that future, because I don't think this team, contrary to maybe what Arthur Blank thinks and contrary to what maybe other people think, I don't think beating the 49ers and beating the Saints is a sign that this team is a championship caliber team. I think, they beat 3 playoff teams this year. That's great. And that shows that they should have been a playoff team. But I don't necessarily think that means that, this team is a couple of wins away from being one of the best teams in the NFL and certainly capable of competing. I think they have way too many holes, and those issues have been exposed time and time again these last 2 seasons in particular. And I feel like in order to build that type of championship caliber team that can win with a Matt Ryan, can win with Julio Jones before those guys hang up their cleats, you kind of need to start fresh and you kind of need to move forward. And I feel like keeping Dan Quinn is still part of the psychology of this team and this fan base and whatever you want to call it, where I still think we're looking back at 2016 and seeing like, how can we get back there? And I think as great as those wins over the Saints and the Eagles and 49ers were this season, I feel like they're kind of holding this team back, because we're sitting there saying like, oh, that's the team that's a playoff team. That's a team that can make a deep postseason run. And it's just like, well, those are just any given Sunday, teams can lose and win in this league. And just because you beat a couple of good teams doesn't necessarily mean that you're on the level of those teams. The fact that you lose to the Cardinals, the fact that you lose to the Titans, a pre-Ryan Tannehill Titans, the fact that you really struggle against the Tampa Bay Buccaneers, who are a solid football team, but by no means a juggernaut. I just kind of think like you have to sort of move forward and bring in a new coach that's going to say, okay, yeah, we're not quite there yet. We're more of that sort of 8-8 type of team, and we need to build towards being that 12-4 type of team that we can be in a situation like the 49ers are, like the Saints have been the last couple of years, like the Patriots are every year, like the Ravens are, where we can sit there and say, yes, we are absolutely the best football team in the league, and let's go out there and over the course of 2 or 3 years, make a serious run at winning championships. And I don't think you can do that with Dan Quinn. I just think you're kind of trying to hold on to this, evaporating hope that Dan Quinn's going to get this team back up to the mountaintop where they seem to be, in 2016, in 2017. But my worry is that we're looking back as opposed to looking ahead. And so that was one of the reasons why I was sort of not necessarily pushing for, but certainly open to making a coaching change. And, the hope right now is, that Dirk Cutter will be able to fix some of these issues, all the issues that you've laid out, DW, today, and also yesterday on Twitter with many of the issues in this offense that similar to what we saw with Steve Sarkisian in 2017, where he made significant changes. They brought in Greg Knapp to help him better understand the West Coast offense. Maybe we can get Todd Monken from Cleveland or whatever, because everybody knows that Todd Monken ran a better version of the Dirk Cutter offense, or everybody doesn't know that because they still give Dirk Cutter credit for that 2018 Buccaneers offense, but it was really Todd Monken. And now that Cleveland staff has been fired, like maybe we can bring him in to sort of help him out. So I'm hoping, that we can make some of these changes and we can give it a go. And this team in 2020 will be the team that I think a lot of us thought they would be in 2019, where we had expectations that they would be a playoff team. And given how strong a schedule that they would face, if they could win 9 or 10 or more games with one of the hardest schedules in the league, that would be a team that was certainly capable of potentially competing in January and potentially making a deep run. And of course, that didn't come to fruition. So I'm hoping that, another bite at the apple, maybe that team will show up. But if I'm being completely honest, I'm not at all optimistic or confident that that's going to happen. I just feel like, okay, well, we'll just be 8-8 or 7-9 again next year. And then they'll make the change that they probably should have made this year. But again, hope springs eternal. If you're a Falcon fan, you know that to be true, because they haven't given you a ton of things to be overly joyous and overly optimistic about over the last few decades. Even though they have been a successful team, it just always feels like, they always fall a little bit short of sort of, being the pride and joy that we all want them to be. So we'll just sort of have to see how it goes. But yeah, I'm not super, super optimistic about the immediate future of this team.
Now, before we kind of move on and kind of talk about what we expect for like the off season, free agency, all that fun stuff, I do want to get both of your thoughts on kind of some of the rumors floating around as far as Arthur Blank's role in all this. People have been saying that he kind of meddled a little bit, maybe in 2019 in some of the offseason moves. And that kind of explains why now Rich McKay is kind of acting as a middleman for Dimitroff and Quinn. DW, do you buy any of those rumors at all, that Arthur Blank maybe played a bigger role than maybe we thought with some of these teams' recent moves?
Yeah, Dave Cho actually wrote about it at the Falcoholic. And I don't think it was as widespread as some people have said. I do think an example where maybe Blank interceded was the whole kicking situation, which was just bungled from the very beginning. With Matt Bryant to Vecchio, and of course the mid-season firing of Bryant after missing some 50-yard field goals. I think that's an area where Blank probably jumped in because, when we brought in Blair Walsh, the 3 days he was a Falcon in training camp, I think that was a moment where probably that whole thing just reeked of incompetence, and the owner finally jumping in and saying, "This enough is enough. Bring Matt Bryant back. Bring in the known commodity." And if you look at sort of the theme of what is happening now at the end of the season, going with the known commodity, it's sort of is carrying through now. Where hey, go back to Bryant. And when he was cut, I understand wanting to move on from a kicker who is 44 years old. Certainly, he's the same age as I am. We were born the same month, so I completely get the whole concern about age and injuries and all that. But going back to him, I think that's the area where Blank sort of he heard the cries from the fan base, and Arthur Blank is a businessman, and he knows that if your fans get too upset with how things are going, they begin to respond with the way that they behave in purchasing tickets and merchandise. And I think he did that as a move to appease the fan base, which was extremely upset with the way things were going. That said, I do think the Rich McKay move was partly about putting a layer of removal between Blank and maybe the stuff that's going on the field. For those who've ever been to a Falcons practice, one of the things you'll notice, Arthur Blank is on the field a lot. Even during training camp. It's one of the things that sort of stood out to me the past several years is, he's out there with the coaches. He's a very involved owner. He always has been. We can think back to the Mike Vick years when, everyone sort of remembers those images of him pushing the wheelchair that Mike Vick was in. Arthur is a very hands-on owner, and I don't think that's a change from what has been the case before. I think maybe, when you're talking about a man who's a billionaire, who has had a tremendous amount of success at business, he trusts his judgment more than most people for a good reason. So I don't think it should be any surprise that he probably did intervene throughout the season. To what extent, I don't think any of us will know, but I do think that I think there is a lot to that. And I think the Rich McKay move may be a signal from Blank that he is trying to put another level between him and the day-to-day decisions with this team.
Aaron, do you have anything else that you'd add to that?
Yeah, I mean, I remember a couple of years, was it 2 years ago, when they brought in somebody to basically run the business side. Was it Steve Cannon? I think it was.
Yep, from Mercedes-Benz.
Yeah, and sort of he was going to run the business side. And, I think a lot of this may be in relation to Arthur Blank's health issues that he's had the last, couple of years, and sort of trying to do better health-wise by taking a lot of the load and stress that owning a football team and dealing with some of these issues that come up day to day from the business side and the football side of things by being an owner. And so I think in terms of bringing back Rich McKay, who, I think gets a bad rap, probably a worse rap than he deserves in terms of his time as a GM, because I think, I think he really stocked that cupboard really well for Mike Smith to come in here and have the immediate success that he had. But I think obviously the only thing that people think about with Rich McKay is hiring Bobby Petrino, and understandably, he got that
Jamal Anderson.
He got that one very, very wrong, and he certainly made his mistake. I don't want to sit here and act like Rich McKay was the greatest GM, but it is one of those things where I do feel like he did a remarkably better job than I think a lot of people often give him credit for bringing in talent over those 4 or 5 years that he was sort of running the show here.
Wasn't he also the Bucks GM when they won the Super Bowl?
Yeah, I mean, he was 14 years or something as the Bucks GM. He was like in the.
I mean, he's a good football mind. I think
he drafted several Hall of Famers. John Lynch, Derek Brooks, Warren Sapp, Trent Dilfer. No, I'm sorry. But not to get too much on a Rich McKay tangent, but like his philosophy in Tampa Bay was like, I'm going to draft athletes, and then Tony Dungy is going to coach those guys up, and he did that remarkably well for the defensive side of the ball. And they tried to do that here in Atlanta with Jim Mora, and it didn't quite work out. You got Jimmy Williams and whatnot. So And I think that's a testament to who's the better coach, not necessarily who's a better one guy being a bad GM. But yeah, so I think, bringing back McKay to the football side of things, like, I don't think it's sort of like this is a sign that the Falcons are going to be terrible. If I had the choice, I'd probably rather have Scott Pioli than Rich McKay, sort of as the third head of, the football operations. But, I do think there's something to sort of the idea that Arthur Blank may be trying to position people to sort of take more off of his plate, not only from the football side of things, from the business side of things. So I certainly think that is something to certainly discuss and keep an eye on moving forward. And maybe that's a reason why he didn't necessarily feel as compelled to have to sort of get back out in front by wind up firing a coach and possibly a GM, because he's just not necessarily desiring to sort of do that again and go through that process to try to find the right people again for the fifth time that he's been the owner, to sort of steer the ship. So maybe he's playing it a little safe. I certainly think that's a fair criticism, but we'll just sort of have to see how it works out. So
let's get into some of this offseason stuff. This is one of my favorite times of the year. I like this time just because every team's on an even playing field in the offseason. Everyone started from scratch. There's a lot of speculating. There's a lot of what ifs. I always like to play that game. So let's kind of talk about, running this regime back, what this means necessarily, for their offseason priorities, where, their needs probably are most. I think left guard's obviously going to be one of them. If Jamon Brown being a healthy scratch these last couple weeks is any indication, they're kind of admitting fault on that these moves did not go as they had worked or had planned. So left guard's obviously going to be a need again, whether they, continue to sink more money in the offensive line or, like they did with Lindstrom and McGarry on the right side, use the draft again to address that. That remains to be seen. I think also defensive line, I think there was some writing on the wall that, Ed Oliver and Christian Wilkins were very high on their boards, and we'll never really know since both of them didn't make it to that pick 14. But I do think it's been a couple years since they've addressed the defensive line at the top of the draft. I think 2020 might be it. But I kind of want to get your thoughts. Yours, Aaron. Obviously, is that where you see the tops of the needs list go for the Falcons? Is there any other positions that get your attention as far as that need to be addressed for this Falcons team heading into 2020?
I think it has to be defensive line.
Yeah.
Right now we've got Grady Jarrett and who else?
Yeah, pretty much.
Tack McKinley will be on his fourth year, and there's still questions on whether the team will even pick up his fifth-year option at this point. I haven't completely given up on him, but, certainly there's a lot of question marks there. But then, we've got several free agents, and we're not going to be able to keep them all. You look at Claiborne, who I think a lot of fans don't give him the amount of respect he deserves. I like him a lot. I think he's, arguably, even though the numbers aren't there, I think he's one of our better pass rushers. Beasley, unless he's willing to take, a much smaller deal, I don't think we'll be back. Jack Crawford, I believe, is a free agent. So we've got a lot of guys just, from both starters and from a depth standpoint on the defensive line that are not going to be back next year. So if you don't spend draft capital, then you're going to have to go to free agency, and that's an expensive position to fill in free agency with quality players. So yes, I think you have to start looking defensive line in the first round of the draft. I've heard some people say, well, what about, what if there's not someone that's really good there? What if there's a good, offensive guard or, God forbid, a corner? And honestly, even though he's never done it, and I can't believe I'm going to say it, Dimitroff should consider trying to trade back in the first round. I know it's I think he has an allergy to trading back in the first round. But you have to address the defensive line. It clearly, whether you want to debate the quality issues this year, you have a deficit of players now, and we've got to get better on the defensive line. If you're actually going to turn around and make this a playoff team in 2020, you've got to be able to pressure the quarterback more consistently than they did this year. So yes, defensive line, which probably means they'll draft a center in the first round. But yeah, for me, it's defensive line or bust.
I'm glad you brought up corner because I know that's probably one of the other positions Aaron might throw out there as a suggestion. I mean, we talked about it. I think the coverage had as much to do with the defensive struggles early in the season. Not being able to cover that first read, the quarterback being able to get the ball out of his hands very quick played a big role in how bad the defense was. So I do think cornerbacks in play, although now I think it's a little bit less in play. And Aaron, if you want to give your thoughts now on what you think of the state of the cornerback room might be, heading into 2020 with this regime coming back.
Yeah, I mean, Matt and I were talking before we jumped on sort of that idea, exactly that, of with a new coaching staff, I would have felt like cornerback would have been very high on the priority list because a new coaching staff wouldn't have been as loyal to someone like a Desmond Trufant, wouldn't have been as loyal to an Isaiah Oliver, Kendall Sheffield, and some of these other guys, certainly not a Bleedy Ray Wilson, we didn't draft these guys. Let's get our own guys in here. I am in the minority opinion, it seems, from a lot of people. I don't think the Falcons cornerbacks have been particularly good this season. I think they've been pretty awful for a large swath of the season. And I think a lot of their defensive success hasn't been because they've gotten good coverage. It's been because of their defensive line. Now, I certainly think Sheffield and Oliver certainly has played much better in the second half than he did in the first half of the season. Bleedy Ray Wilson, these last couple of games has not been that problematic. He certainly made a ton of plays. That San Francisco game stood out, and that was something that we broke down on film. So go back and check out that episode if you didn't, to highlight some of his outstanding plays. Sheffield has been, certainly better than I think a lot of people expected him to be going into the season. But I don't look at any of those three guys. Like, to me, all of those guys are third, fourth, and fifth corners in terms of what I think they are right now. Now, obviously, Oliver and Sheffield are young and continue to grow. And I think that's going to be the expectation with this regime, that they're going to continue to grow in that regard. And I just think if you can get a good corner, and from what I can tell, this draft class is going to have some really good corners available at the top of the draft, what would stop you from doing that? So for me, I think cornerback is a need, but I think, Matt, you nailed it in the sense of I don't think it's going to be that big a priority because this coaching staff, this regime is going to have a lot more loyalty to these guys that they've used, premium draft picks on these last couple of years. So I think it's a position that they'll probably look to shore up their depth. They'll probably look to add someone that can compete and push Oliver as sort of their outside number two corner opposite Trufant. If Sheffield is going to be sort of inserted as the nickel guy, I don't think it's going to be a big priority for them, which, we'll just sort of have to see if that works out in their favor, or if we're having the conversation again, 9 months from now, like, hey, I don't know if the cornerback play is great, but if they sort of neglect that position, if you want to call it that, hopefully all the time and attention that they could have spent on addressing the cornerback position, they do wind up investing in the defensive line, because I do agree with you that is the top priority. They certainly need bodies there. I personally would argue that the bodies that they currently have on the defensive line, I have a much more positive opinion on than the bodies that they currently have at the cornerback position. But as DW said, there's going to be so much turnover. You don't know how much time Claiborne, even if he comes back, what he's got left in the tank, because there was a large chunk of this season where he didn't, he wasn't living up to expectations, particularly like the first month or so of the season. Jack Crawford was basically non-existent for the first 9 or 10 games and has turned it on lately. Alan Bailey was a solid run defender, but really wasn't bringing you much of anything as a pass rusher until after the bye week. So even if you do bring some of these guys back, you certainly need more help, because you can't necessarily go into next season, as the team has done the last 2 off seasons, overly confident that, we don't need to make any changes because, can they put more stock into Vic Beasley for the third year in a row that they're going to be able to fix Vic Beasley? Like the thing is with Vic Beasley, he's been better this season. He's had one of the better years he's had the last couple of years, but it's still not enough. That's really the issue, certainly for the price that they're paying him. So I think they need a lot more help at the D-line group, but certainly if I was running the show, I'd still be looking hard at that cornerback if I can get a good body. But again, I don't think that's going to be necessarily at the top of their priority list. And hopefully, them punting on the cornerback position means that they don't punt on the D-line, which I think they have done, particularly when it's come to adding pass rushers these past 2 off seasons. Because, John Kaminsky, good, solid young player, but he's not bringing it as a pass rusher. Alan Bailey, solid player, but again, as the season showed, not a valuable pass rusher, or at least a consistent guy. Tyler Davidson, we know, is a run stopper. Deidre Sanat, solid young player, but certainly not going to be making his name as a pass rusher. So really they've put all their resources into addressing the run defense on the defensive line. And hopefully they can do a similar thing to address the pass rush, in addition to potentially making some additional upgrades for that run defense this offseason.
Now, one point I do want to make as far as what to expect with the draft, the Dan Quinn and Thomas Dimitroff partnership, it's pretty much been a 50-50 split as far as draft distribution goes. So they've been kind of keeping it pretty even as far as addressing the offense, addressing the defense. Every draft, you go down the list from 2015 to 2019, it's been half and half for the most part. So the Falcons got 7 picks. You should expect maybe 3 of them to be on the offense side of the football. So, we're always pounding the table for a draft where they really just go all in on the defense, go all in on the defensive line. I am still kind of expecting 2 picks, whether it be 2 edges or 2 defensive interior guys, or, probably the more likely scenario, 1 interior guy, 1 edge guy. That should probably be the ceiling of what you expect with this, them addressing the defensive line. I mean, there's obviously free agency to get to, but I think that's one thing to consider with them bringing these guys back, Quinn and Dimitroff. They're going to still address the offense in the draft. So whether it be a receiver, running back, we mentioned offensive line, I think that's something to consider. So Aaron talked about, a bunch of guys that are either free agents, DW did as well, free agents, or guys that are expected or, under contract, but maybe not expected back. So maybe we can get into some of them and kind of what our thoughts are, with Claiborne, Beasley, Crawford, Austin Hooper, I think, is the big one, top of the list. He had met with the media today, and, he kind of gave a very, lukewarm answer as far as what his future holds in Atlanta. I think we would all expect him to still be back. But, he did make a note that, he hasn't received an offer yet from the Falcons. So, again, I don't know if that's something to read into, but
I wouldn't necessarily, because I think Campbell also said that as well. And I think just
and Beasley as well, too.
I don't think the front office knew that they were going to have jobs, so they weren't necessarily getting a jump on contract negotiations because they didn't know if they were going to be around.
And again, I don't know, because I watched the end of the season press conference today, and they gave very non-committal answers on the players. And again, maybe that's because of the fact that their job security was very uncertain. But I know in years past, they were pretty outspoken. I remember last year, Tevin Coleman, they kind of said it pretty cut and dry that they weren't going to bring him back. So again, maybe that's the reason why. But when the trade deadline was heating up and all that, reports were out there that the Falcons, Hooper factored into their future. So I would still expect that, it's probably likely that he gets the franchise tag in the early going, which in 2020, it's expected to be a little over $11 million for tight ends. And the hope is, just like kind of with Grady Jarrett, they would work up until that mid-July deadline to try to get a long-term deal done. But what are some of the thoughts? Devontae Freeman's another one. DW, what do you think this means? Devontae Freeman, a guy like him, it's probably more likely that he's back, given that, there's a lot of pressure on this coaching staff now, even more so than last year. Would they run the risk not having a veteran presence in the backfield to try to, again, establish this running game that Dan Quinn's so, dead set on, trying to renew and restore in Atlanta?
Yeah, Freeman's an interesting name because, and I've got Over the Cap open on my other monitor just for reference here, which I know is a favorite site for people who pretend to know the salary cap in the NFL, which I'm going to do right now.
Pretend. Yes, pretend. Yeah.
Devontae Freeman's interesting because, cutting him next year is only going to save about $3.5 million. I believe, correct me if I'm wrong, that they can't use, unless a new CBA is put in place, they can't use the post June 1st cut on
That's our understanding
in
as well,
CBA. Yeah. So we're going to go under the assumption that they can't use that. So they're only going to save about $3.5 million against the cap. According to OTC,
that means $6 million of dead cap, right? DW,
right? Yeah, which is pretty significant.
Yep.
So that you have to keep that in mind. And in Freeman, and this is Aaron, I know you're going to appreciate this because I feel like it's the one thing I keep seeing on Twitter from people is that Devontae Freeman is actually a very good pass blocker, despite what people keep saying about him, because they go back to the one play in the Super Bowl that they sort of cling to. And it is an important trait for a starter at that position. Ito Smith, when he was given those opportunities, was actually quite dreadful as a pass blocker this season.
That's what got him hurt, didn't it?
It is. It's partly,
times,
it's he tried to block too high. He was way too upright to take on somebody twice his size, and it partly is what caused the neck injury. I think it's 50-50 on Freeman. The cap savings, I think, is going to be a factor. Although I think you have to look at other players and you have to think that someone like a Desmond Trufant, either I don't know if they're going to cut him per se. Maybe there's an opportunity to rework, his contract to free up some cap. And Alex Mack is an interesting name. He's someone I would like to see them do something with, maybe for a 1-year extension to create some cap room. But Freeman to me is the most interesting name. I still feel like there's a good chance he gets cut. But to your point, when they brought this coaching staff back, this whole theme of continuity is really making me rethink those initial decisions I had made, sort of during the season. And Freeman's at the top of that. I now think before these guys were coming back, I felt like it was almost a foregone conclusion he'd be gone. I think it's a toss up now.
And I would make that same point, and I think Aaron would probably agree as far as Desmond Trufant goes. I think there was, to your point earlier, I think there was a good chance that a new coaching staff might have done something with him because, the cap savings for cutting him would have been, I think, maybe $11 million, unless that's the post June 1. But even so, I think it's more than the 3.5 that you'd save with Devontae Freeman. So there was a chance a new regime might have cut him. Now with this coaching staff coming back, again, the pressure for 2020 that they basically have to get in the playoffs or Dan Quinn's probably gone, you're not going to want to roll with an even more inexperienced secondary. I think that's partly what led to the early season struggles with, putting in Isaiah Oliver, replacing Robert Alford and thinking you'd get the same production that Alford gave. A lot of us were optimistic of that, but it turned out that wasn't the case. So that I'd put Desmond Trufant in that same category. Aaron, would you do the same probably, I guess, as far as it's more likely that he's going to be back?
Yeah. I kind of always thought he would be back just because of my relatively low opinion of the non-Desmond Trufant corners. But it is one of those things where you talk about the cap savings. It's only about $5 million pre-June. So right, yeah. It's a $10 million dead money hit, which is you got to be really confident that you can replace his value if you're going to basically pay him $10 million to not play football for you.
Yeah.
You have to be really basically like, oh yeah, it's addition by subtraction, which I think based off of how Trufant played this year wasn't really going to be the case. But I agree with you. There was certainly a chance that I think he could get cut this offseason with the new regime. I think that chance, I won't say is zero, but certainly is probably down below 20%, down 10%, something like along those lines at this point in time with this regime coming back. But I do think with Freeman, he's the one guy that I thought was a very likely goner with a new coaching staff. But now I'm on the same lines as DW. I still think it's likely he'll get cut, but I think it's closer to a toss-up at this point in time than I felt like it was likely 2-3 weeks ago.
Right. And just so the fans are aware too, I mean, cutting these guys, it works the same way with trades. So if they were to, reopen trade conversations with Devontae Freeman for, say, the Lions, like they did during the trade deadline, the dead cap works the same way. It would still be a $6 million dead money cap hit if they were to try to trade Devontae again in the off season. So with that all being said, I guess kind of, I think it's worth mentioning there was a bit of news on Saturday in regards to the salary cap in relation to Matt Ryan and Grady Jarrett's contracts. They were both reworked and restructured, very similar fashion to the way, Matt Ryan's deal was restructured last year. And, per Field Yates, that opened up a little over $12 million in cap savings. Now, the one point that I want to add, and I added it on Twitter, was, again, while this was expected and it's all well and good, it's not as aggressive as, the front office could have taken with this. If they had done the max restructures, which, again, that would have meant pushing more guaranteed money kind of down the alleyway for these guys. But, the way I see it, it's kind of inconsequential for guys like Matt Ryan and Grady Jarrett who are going to be here for the long haul. But had they done the max restructure, they could have saved close to $21 million or a little over $21 million. So there's about $9 million they kind of left on, the negotiating table. So really, the way I see this is they just kind of got themselves in the black. There's some reported numbers that Falcons were like minus 10 million or minus 6 million in cap space heading into 20. This kind of gets them off the hook on that. Certainly doesn't open them up to, again, be major players yet. They're going to have to do some other things. So that's why, I'm wondering if it's not Devontae Freeman, if it's not Desmond Trufant, where are there other avenues? We kind of mentioned, or if we didn't, we talked about Alan Bailey. Alan Bailey, I think, is one. DW, where do you think this team looks to create more cap space so that they can maybe make a splash or two in free agency?
I mentioned Alex Mack. He's, I believe, going to be 35, maybe 36 next year. I personally wouldn't cut him, even though he had arguably one of his worst seasons, which is... He
finished strong, which he
did, yes. Yeah, absolutely.
But yeah.
But compared to his normal like all pro level
right.
of play, he was sort of like a league average center for a good bit of the season. I think you can restructure him, get him an extra year on his contract to free up some cap space, which I think would be a better method of handling that as opposed to the Peter Cons after McClure mess that we got into back in 2013. Yeah. So I would prefer to keep Max. So I think you could, free up some money there. I look at someone like Matt Schaub, and I know that the savings there aren't going to be huge, but I do think they're going to look at Kurt Benkert a little, stronger, and maybe Danny Etling as a potential backup quarterback. Even though Schaub
likes that one, right, Aaron?
Absolutely.
Even though, to his credit, Schaub did, when he was called upon, he did everything you could ask for from a backup quarterback, and I feel like he deserves credit for that. And he sort of dispelled, some of the hatred that fans gave him for being a 95-year-old backup quarterback. So I don't see a lot. I think you may look at another salary to bonus conversion for someone like a Jake Matthews, maybe a Julio, because he's got I think a sizable salary in 2020 you can convert. I don't think that they can't go on a cutting spree per se, which I know is usually what people do, especially on Over the Cap. It's so easy to go in and say cut. The problem is that if you look at that key number at the top, players under contract, you eventually have to get back up to 53. And if all you do is cut, you still have to get guys signed in. And the only way to do that is to sign a bunch of guys for vet minimums, and that's not the way to construct a roster. So I think it's going to be more restructures. I do think we'll see, a cut or two. I think Alan Bailey makes the most sense as far as cutting. Aaron, you said he wasn't particularly effective as a pass rusher. And I always felt like his deal was intended to be a 1-year deal, and they did it for cap savings as a 2-year deal. But past that, I'm looking more at restructures and the salary to bonus conversions, like what they just did with Grady and Ryan.
Yeah, and I think Ty Sombrello is one that we haven't talked about. I think he's probably the most slam dunk one. while he did look great as a backup tight end this past Sunday on that play, he looked very athletic. I got to give him that. Given the presence of Matt Gano, you'd think his $5 million cap hit in 2020. That's way too high to be a backup tackle. So he I think is the most slam dunk one. I do think probably Matt Schaub, Alan Bailey also, and then maybe Luke Stocker. I'm curious what they think of Luke Stocker, just because he is a malarkey and cutter guy, and he did do some good things as a run blocker. Obviously he's not a receiving threat, and do they want a better pass blocking tight end, since that's what he was maybe tasked with a lot? I know Aaron's had some issues with that. Aaron, any other guys, any other suggestions that we haven't already covered that you think the Falcons can take advantage of to create some cap space?
Yeah, I got a couple, but to piggyback off of what you said, I think, and this is something that you and I discussed prior to going to air, Matt and I do have, conversations outside of Twitter.
Yeah.
That aren't just back and forth arguments for 3 hours. I think what'll be interesting with some of these guys is whether or not they do sort of the Derek Shelby, where they cut some of these guys to save the immediate cap space and then bring them back on a modest $1 or $2 million deal, which is what they did with Derek Shelby 2 off seasons ago. And you could see some of these guys like Schaub, like Bailey, come back for basically half the price. I think what to me is going to be a little interesting is, do they start to maybe look at trading some guys? Do you get into a situation where you trade someone like a James Carpenter? Do you get in a situation, do you trade someone like a Jamon Brown or a Ricardo Allen or somebody like that, that you can at least tinker with that idea of sort of maybe creating a little bit of cap space by moving some of these guys and getting a draft pick where you can essentially replace them for really cheap. Again, I'm not suggesting that those moves are likely at this point in time, but I do think it's something on the table, at least, that the Falcons can explore moving forward. In terms of some of these guys like a Luke Stocker, I think because of the emergence of someone like a Jaden Graham, and because Luke Stocker wasn't giving you plus value as a blocker, which is what he was brought in to be, you look at sort of his cap savings and what he's being set to make, over $3 million next year and saving $2.6 million against the cap. It doesn't make a whole lot of sense to get basically a league average blocking tight end to pay that sort of premium on her, similar to the situation we saw with Levine Toilolo a couple of years ago. But I do think right now Devontae Freeman among these guys is probably the most interesting case, because the Falcons, Dan Quinn, as Matt mentioned, Dan Quinn is talking about, hashtag physical, getting that physicality back into the offense. And they basically went all in on, quote unquote, fixing the offensive line, which certainly they didn't necessarily do. Although I don't know if all of those were just because they went out and signed the wrong players. I think a lot of that you can potentially blame on injuries. I think some of that you can blame on the blocking scheme. And when you look at it, specifically a guy like Alex Mack, I think a lot of his issues were, related to the injury that he had early in the season and had to play with for the rest of the season. I think he played with a brace for, 13 games this year on that elbow. And then they changed from the outside zone blocking scheme that he was an all-pro at, and then they went to, the inside zone stuff that, whatever Dirk Cutter was doing. And so, I think, to me, the question is going to be, okay, you spent all this money on the offensive line. Now, if you're going to fix the running game, you kind of have to look at the running back room. And we saw with Devontae Freeman, who was up and down this season, didn't look like that, feature back, but certainly had his moments and certainly has value. We saw the 2 games without Devontae, and Brian Hill wasn't really getting things going off the ground. He was certainly much more productive coming off the bench than necessarily being the lead guy. We saw Quadri Olson, do some positive work in short yardage situations. Ito Smith, you guys talked about sort of his concussion issues. You don't know necessarily if you can trust him there. So I do think if the focus is still going to be running the football, in addition to trying to change what Dirk Cutter is doing, which is probably going to be the bigger part of the equation than necessarily making drastic personnel moves. I do wonder if they say, you know what, we need to get a better, more explosive, more dynamic running back on this roster. And if that's the case, you're not going to spend that in free agency, obviously. So you're going to look to prioritize that in the draft. And, you know, that's going to be one way to potentially save some money if you do cut Devontae Freeman and then come in and replace him with, you know, a second or third round pick, you know, a J.K. Dobbins type of player potentially. So that's going to be, to me, one of the bigger areas that I'm going to be keeping an eye on this offseason.
Yeah, and that'll be interesting. I mean, because that'll kind of be a first for Quinn. I don't recall exactly what pick Tevin Coleman was. He was a third rounder, so he had to be, what, a top 70, top 80, top 90 pick. So it'll be, if that's the range you're thinking, I mean, that, I guess that's in line with that. But, you know, that's one of those things with the draft plans and stuff that, again, I hope they put off for at least 1 year. Again, what I saw from Devontae Freeman at the tail end of the season, I do think he has more juice left in the tank. We saw a lot of the vintage Devontae Freeman in those last couple games in the open field. It's just a matter of getting him some open space, some open field, it's the root, that's the heart of, you know, some of the flaws that Dirk Cutter and his offensive system. You know, it's one of the big gripes you have with it. But you know, I certainly think anything's on the table at this point. But you know, if you are going to draft the running back high, that would mean Devontae's gone, and you're talking about getting rid of him and eating $6 million of dead cap in that year. So we'll see. It's certainly not something that I would want to see them do, but there's a lot that they've done recently that we can all say that we wouldn't have done. I guess, you know, the next point that, you know, that we can take this conversation as far as some external free agency maybe plans go. You know, I always try to I get into this during the season. Again, this is one of my favorite times of the year. So I'm always trying to look ahead, see what guys might be out there. So I'm not necessarily, if you have guys and you want to throw them out, certainly by all means do so. But maybe some position groups that you're looking at that you'd want to see the Falcons at least maybe dabble in. DW, I'll let you have the floor as far as what you're thinking, if you have any thoughts there.
In free agency?
Yes.
I mean, always and forever pass rusher.
Yeah.
You know, if you know, and I joined in towards the tail end of your conversation. I know you mentioned Ryan Kerrigan as a name. I mean, if someone like that came free, yes, please, absolutely restructure contracts, cut guys. Let's get you know, as many pass rushers in here as possible. The problem is, and it's sort of the problem we saw last year, is that you start to hear rumors about someone like a Brandon Graham, you know, hitting free agency, and they never get the free agency because good teams realize that, you know, you keep guys who can get to the quarterback.
Yeah.
Which also means that if you can get one of those guys, you get one of those guys. So yeah, I would love to see, you know, a Ryan Kerrigan brought in. The other position, which I feel like, you know, we don't address enough, is maybe safety. I like Rico. I love what he does. I feel like he's one of our better defensive players, but I do think there's a question mark with Keanu Neal with 2 straight years of season-ending injuries. The ACL I wasn't as concerned about, but you know, that Achilles tear, there are a lot of guys that don't come back from that the same. And Keanu's young. I believe that he can overcome it potentially. But safety may be a position that we may have to look at again. And if you can find someone, you know, maybe a veteran that can help fill in and be a good backup and even a spot starter, I think that's a position you have to think about a little bit more. Because I'm not sure that the combo of Rico and KZ has some tackling issues. I'm not sure. You know, we've seen 2 straight years of that. I love what he does as a ball hawk, but his tackling has been subpar so far. I'm not sure that that duo is what we want to roll with for the long term. So I feel like safety is maybe quietly a position where we could do a little bit more in free agency because it's not necessarily an expensive position as well.
Yeah, I think safety is actually a good one. And, you know, I wonder how much it was on their mind, because they did bring in J.J. Wilcox, and who knows how big of a role they anticipated for him. But unfortunately, he had the ACL in training camp. So, I do think that's probably a sneaky under the radar type of move, and, a name that, comes to mind that always seems to, get left out to the very end. But I know Trey Boston is going to be a free agent again. I'll be curious what his market is, or what the safety market in general is, because, it was kind of diminished somewhat over the last couple of years. Again, he's been a starter. He didn't miss a single snap this past year in Carolina. So again, I don't know if that's necessarily the type of guy, but whether it's free agency or, again, I think that's also something that might be in play towards the back half of the draft is getting a strong safety that you think could maybe fill in. Because, Aaron and I talk quite a bit about this guy on our show. It's almost like the Sherrod Niesman show at times on Falcon Central Radio, but they don't want to, give him the keys to the backup strong safety spot, which, I don't know why. He filled in pretty admirably in 2018.
Yeah.
But, with that being said, it seems like they're going to look elsewhere, and, whether it's free agency or the draft, I think that is in play to a degree. Aaron, what about you? Any thoughts as far as positions you might want to address in free agency or look to address there?
No, I think safety is a great point made by DW, because I do think, I think there's an expectation from a lot of people that the Falcons need to kind of turn the page on Keanu Neal and turn the page on Ricardo Allen and get a young sort of safety. And I'm sort of the mindset, because, I'm a Keanu Neal stan till I die. But, I feel like give him the opportunity to come back from that injury. If he does, amazing. He's basically Thomas Davis 2.0. If he doesn't, then, no shame in that. And then you sort of address the long-term situation there. And so I think if you're going to go after a safety, because you mentioned it, J.J. Wilcox, Jonathan Cyprien, Sherrod Niesman, who we've mentioned on pretty much every episode of this podcast for at least 6 months straight. The Falcons kind of bungled that whole safety depth thing. And you can argue that a big reason why their defense was so bad in the first half of the season was because they bungled that safety position. And it really wasn't until they moved Casey back there that things started to stabilize and this defense started to click better. And, they just can't really afford to go into another season just, Kamal Ishmael and DeMonte, they have to sort of address that. So for me, I think that's a position that I would address. Linebacker is another position group, because you're basically looking at Deion Jones, Foye Oluokun, and that's about it as guys under contract. So you're going to need some bodies there at the very least. Because I don't know if Devondre Campbell's coming back. I would be shocked at this point. And this is something that we talked about during the season when, the defense wasn't looking so good because Deion Jones wasn't playing great football. The idea of maybe Deion Jones is better served as a weak side linebacker. That was something that, every now and then when Deion Jones is not doing great, we bring up. We talked about it in 2016. We talked about it probably a little bit in 2017 before he really turned things on that year. And then, last year he got hurt, so we weren't really talking about it because we were chomping at the bit to get him back at middle linebacker. But it is one of those things where, I think the idea of having a veteran presence, someone like a Danny Trevathan would make a lot of sense. That sort of veteran guy that brings a similar skill set to Deion Jones and maybe can be the guy that can call your defense and allow Deion Jones to maybe slide out to the weak side linebacker spot and maybe give you some value there. I haven't necessarily looked at the rest of the free agent group to see if there's any sort of plan B options. Sean Lee, I think, is a guy that might be a free agent as well. But
right.
Or at least a potential cap cut or something like that. And obviously he's an older guy, constantly getting nicked up, but certainly that type of veteran presence that you're kind of looking for to really solidify. And, instinctually, Sean Lee hasn't slowed down in any sense of the form, just maybe physically he has. But you can argue that even though he isn't quite the athlete that Devondre Campbell is, he's light years better from an instinctual standpoint. And so that they would kind of offset each other if you wound up replacing Devondre Campbell with Sean Lee in that regard. So certainly some things to play around with in terms of, you're just going to need bodies. how good those bodies are going to be at the linebacker position remains to be seen. And it's going to be a situation, I think, because their cap situation isn't ideal. I don't think their cap situation is dire, but I do think they're going to probably have to rely on and adding a lot of cheap bodies this offseason. Similar, I think we've talked about this before, but it's kind of like you kind of need to make a lot of Tyler Davidson type of moves, across the roster, where you're getting guys that are pretty solid for pretty cheap deals, close to veteran minimum deals, rather than going out and making some of these splash signings. So I'm very curious to sort of see what the team does, because these last couple of off seasons, they kind of sat on their hands, and we've seen, Shaq Barrett being probably the most prominent example of these really good players that go for really, really cheap. And you're like, man, how did they get that guy for that cheap amount of money? Why couldn't we do that? We had enough money to make that move. And I'm hoping, the Falcons can sort of, stop twiddling their thumbs and maybe be that type of team. I think we talked about it on a previous episode. We talked about, I think, Buffalo. One of our callers brought up, the plan, the strategy that Buffalo had in free agency a couple of weeks or months ago, in terms of they just went out and just basically were scattershot with, we're going to go out there and sign 15 guys for relatively cheap. And it worked for them with their offensive line and sort of revamping that unit.
Quinn Spain was a big one at left guard. I mean, $2 million for 1 year. He was a Malarkey guy too. So, I don't know what necessarily happened there, but yeah, something like that. They're going to have to bargain bin shop for the most part. A guy like Kerrigan, though, on a 1 year, like $8 million deal, or like an Alan Bailey type of contract where you kind of spread it out over 2 years, but it's more like a 1 year deal. Those are the types of guys that I think they can afford. They're not going to afford any big. They're not going to be huge players on day one and get the big money guys. But you mentioned Danny Trevathan. I think him being 30 years old, he is coming off a significant elbow injury, but I still think you can potentially bring him in to be a bridge, because I do think they need to potentially address linebacker in the draft. So I'm kind of looking at those bridge type signings where, veterans that you can count on for a year or two, so that your rookies aren't necessarily tasked with playing right away. Because again, I don't think the linebacker free agency crop is great. Joe Schobert's a guy I have written down. He's going to be a free agent in Cleveland. Hasn't had a great season, but in years prior, he's been one of the better linebackers. He was a Pro Bowler a couple years ago. So if we'll see what his market is. Corey Littleton's a free agent from the Rams. He had a very good season, so he's probably going to be out of their price range. So there's not great options, but I think there is a couple of veterans. You mentioned Sean Lee. I think that would make some sense. But yeah, I like those two position groups. Inside linebacker, pass rusher. I think getting veterans on this defense, because this defense has been carried by the draft picks, and probably to a fault these last couple of years. So getting some veterans, some veteran voices, I think is key, and we'll see what they end up doing there. But I guess maybe to close the show, kind of looking ahead, before we get into maybe some questions from listeners, if there are any in the chat, but kind of the expectations for 2020. The Falcons finished in second place this season, so they're going to have a second place schedule, which means they're going to go on the road to face the Cowboys, who finished second in the East. They're going to stay at home to face the Seahawks, who finished second in the West. And then they're going to have the NFC North. They're going to have the AFC West, and then obviously they're going to have their NFC South slate. So, DW, what's kind of your expectations for 2020? I know, we started at the top of the show not being very optimistic based on, some of these moves and decisions over the last, 48 to 72 hours. But, what do you think of the schedule, and what do you think of the Falcons' chances in 2020?
I think the schedule is going to be a difficult one again, unfortunately. But I will say this, the landscape in the NFC South is a big wild card right now. You look at Tampa, there are a lot of questions on whether Jameis Winston's going to be brought back, and certainly, 30 interceptions and I think a dozen fumbles during the season makes it a difficult proposition to pay him $30 million a year. So if you're looking at quarterback stability, you look at Carolina, and there's a lot of talk that, Cam Newton's going to move on. And I'm bringing up these teams because ultimately the Falcons may go into 2020 with the most stable quarterback position in the NFC South, because there's a good chance that, if the Saints do something this year, Drew Brees may be done. And then you look at Cam Newton, and if he's actually going to be kept in Carolina, it looks like that there's a possibility he leaves. The Falcons may go into 2020 with the only returning starting quarterback. And that matters. That still matters. And I think they're going to have another season like this one, but they could be a team that wins the NFC South by default, as other clubs are, reinventing themselves at the quarterback position. It could be one of those fluky years where the Falcons go like 9-7. I feel like they're going to hover in that 7-9, 9-7 range because of Dirk Cutter and his inability to run an effective NFL offense in the year 2020. But they may do just enough to possibly win the division in what could be a big year of turnover for three clubs other than the Falcons. So the continuity thing may actually play to their favor in getting them a win in the division. But I'm not sure that it's going to result in anything more than, a quick playoff visit and exit when you go up against a far better constructed team like, the San Francisco 49ers. So I feel like this is, 2020 still feels like it's going to be sort of a mediocre team with some talent that gets held back, but they could do something because the division is sort of in tumult right now. And they could benefit simply from some of the chaos around them.
Aaron, do you want to shed any light on 2020?
Yeah, I mean, I kind of said at the top, I just kind of feel like it's destined for another sort of 8-8 sort of year, something hovering. Maybe, they can get better than that. But, I look at the schedule and, I'm looking at the AFC West, you can already kind of, and it's not even January, and making predictions about, what their record is going to be is pretty silly at this point, but I'm going to do it because we need content on this podcast. So, I could sort of already chalk up Kansas City as a loss. And then it's just kind of like, okay, the Chargers, the Broncos, and the Raiders. And I kind of feel like my impression of the Falcons is that they're kind of on the same level as those three other teams. Like, I don't feel like they're significantly better than those teams. And we know they tend to struggle against AFC teams. So, it's one of those things where, like, they could go 3-0 against those teams. They can go 2-1 or 1-2 or 0-3 against those teams. It's anybody's guess at this point in time. But I look at the NFC North, like, and again, similarly, I'm like Minnesota. They always lose to Minnesota. So you already chalk that up as a loss. And so if you're going to go 2-2 against, that NFC North division, that means you got to beat someone, let's say you're going to beat Detroit. You got to beat either the Bears in their defense, which I'm not very confident with Dirk Cutter and how he runs this offense, that they can beat a good defense like that. But, Mitch Trubisky's pretty terrible. So, you can never say never. And then the Packers, who I kind of think of are a little bit of a fluke, but certainly not a terrible football team by any means, based off winning 13 games this year. So you got to beat one of those two teams, the Bears or the Packers, to go 2-2 in that division. Obviously, you have, the NFC South, which, I think certainly DW raises good points that it could be in flux, but my expectation is I think Drew Brees, Cam Newton, and Jameis Winston will all be back on those teams next year. I don't think there's going to be nearly as much turnover at the quarterback position as I think a lot of people are projecting and have been projecting for the last couple of weeks. I just think teams tend to be very conservative at the quarterback position, where it's like, if you have, look at Andy Dalton. Andy Dalton probably lasted 5 more years than he probably should have in Cincinnati. And they're finally only going to make the move because they now have the number 1 pick and there's a clear cut sort of number 1 quarterback. But, if Joe Burrow wasn't in this draft class and Tua Tagovailoa was hurt, I don't know if Cincinnati would move on from Andy Dalton this offseason. So I feel like, and then, the last 2 games are, Dallas and Seattle. And I feel like, they'll probably split against those teams. So when I sit here and do the math, I'm looking at a team that's probably, certainly capable of winning more, but is probably going to win 7, 8, maybe 9 games if they can, play up to, their potential. But I just don't see a whole lot to get excited about right now. So obviously it's very, very early in the process. We'll see, what projections and predictions I just made about what these teams will wind up being change over the next several months. But it just kind of seems like they're kind of destined for another sort of average type of season. I think that's kind of what they are. I feel like, we've tried to convince ourselves these last couple of years that this team is, on par with some of the elite teams, on par with teams like the Rams, like the Patriots, et cetera, that have been, the Ravens this year, Chiefs, that are among the best teams in the league and the teams that everybody talks about as the best these last couple of years. And because we beat teams like those from time to time, like we did this year with San Francisco and New Orleans, I think it just kind of leads us to believe that they're better than what they are. But then when you see them lose games against the Cardinals and Bucks, it kind of just all comes crashing down back to earth. So until I can see a team that can consistently show up and win, whether they're close games or blowouts against some of these lesser opponents, which we haven't really seen from this team since 2016, like I just can't have a ton of confidence that next year is going to be any different than this year was.
Yeah. And one point I want to throw out there, because I see this take far too often, or I saw it, far too often, like in the last 24 hours, just based on the fact that the Falcons finished in second place and now they're getting a second place schedule. I mean, really, we're talking about two games here. We're talking about the Cowboys game. We're talking about Seattle. Everything else would have been the same as far as the schedule goes. So, had they lost to the Bucks, you're facing the Giants and the Rams. Which the Rams, I think, might honestly be better than the Seahawks, but the Seahawks got pretty lucky. I mean, 10 of their 11 wins were
one-score games.
So I think, that matchup in particular for 2020, they're due for a little regression and might not be as good as their record says they are right now. Dallas is a wild card right now. It looks like they're going to fire Jason Garrett, so who knows who's going to be leading that team. I mean, they have a lot of talent, so if they hire the right guy, that could be a tough matchup. So I would probably tend to agree with Aaron that maybe you're splitting that 2-game series. So, they're not going to miss the playoffs because they had a second place schedule. They're going to miss the playoffs for the reasons we kind of laid out early in the show, as far as, the offensive scheme holding them back, the defense still not being a top-notch unit, coaching decisions here and there to, clock management, all of that stuff. That's going to be the reason that this team, in my mind, I think I agree that it's probably the ceiling's 9-7, and whether that's good enough to win in the NFC and get in the playoffs, probably not. If history is any indication, maybe next year's different. I mean, that's another thing. It's like you never know from year to year who's good and who's not going to be good. I don't think any of us would have sat here and said at this point last year that the 49ers would be the number one team in the NFC.
Yep.
So there's always a surprise from year to year. So whether that's going to be on the Falcons' schedule or not, that's going to stand in their way, we won't know until we get closer to the season. So, but yeah, I kind of agree with you guys. My expectations, my excitement levels, not very high based on what's come out of this past weekend at Flowery Branch. And, we can only hope for the best, and we'll see what happens. But Aaron, do we have any questions, any comments in the chat at all tonight? Has it been active?
Yeah, people, we're contributing to our free agent discussion. A name that wasn't really brought up was Jack Crawford.
I think he's gone. I would agree with Matt. He kind of was one of the bigger disappointments as far as players go this year. I was hoping for him to kind of continue his career best season in 2018, and whether it was kind of the scheme change and them switching to more of a pseudo 3-4, maybe that didn't necessarily fit Jack Crawford. That could have had a lot to do with it.
Yes, it's not a coincidence that they went back to the 4-3 under in the second half of the season, and
do you
Jack Crawford played better.
Do you guys expect that going forward? I mean, because I had thought a lot of it had to do with Vic Beasley, and that was kind of the perfect fit for him as being more of a linebacker than a D end. What are your expectations for how the defense looks as far as a schematic standpoint? You think they're going to stick with that 4-3, I guess, then, since that's what we saw more in the second half?
I would imagine so. I can't see them try, their defense only worked when they basically went back to basics and they dumbed down the defense. And so,
And did that have a lot to do with more being in the nickel, though? Or, I mean, you're saying the base defense because there were still bits and pieces that I saw that they've.
Yeah, I mean, it wasn't exclusively 4-3 under, but it was predominantly 4-3 under, is what I'm saying.
Yeah, I mean, I'm interested to see what that means for some of these guys. Like, because Davidson, I thought, while he doesn't fit the profile of, this 340-pound nose tackle, I thought being in that 3-4 look makes more sense for him than being, a 4-3 nose tackle. And maybe we finally get to see Dejan Snot. I know we've all been kind of hoping and praying that happens, and we'll see what 2020 holds there, because I think he's more of the 4-3 nose tackle. But something we didn't bring up, I wouldn't be shocked if they bring Tyler Davison back, on a small kind of multi-year deal, something like Corey Peters got several years ago in Arizona, 3 years, maybe 11 to 12 million. I just think they really liked him. He was a big part of their free agent plans and their draft plans. And while again he doesn't really offer much in the pass rush, I do think a lot of their improvements in the run game can be attributed to him. So again, I don't know what that holds for Dejan Snot. If that's the case, then he was all but a wasted draft pick, and that's unfortunate because he's not a bad player. Anytime he's out there, he can hold the point of attack. Occasionally he's mixed in a few pass rush moves, but yeah, I'm interested to see, because he's one of those guys I think they might bring back. Falcons is going to throw us a curveball and draft Isaiah Simmons in round 1. Again, I think we're looking at a scenario, best player available on defense is where I would put the first round pick. I don't know if you agree or disagree, DW. I know you jokingly said is in play, which I wouldn't be shocked either there. I think, if the value fits.
Yeah, I'm generally in favor of BPA. But again, a lot is going to depend on what they do in free agency. So it's if they get some guys on defensive line, keep some of these guys like a Claiborne and whatnot, then yeah, if you go linebacker at 16, someone that can really play both in coverage and play well against the run, I wouldn't have a conniption fit like I would if it was a running back.
Yeah, that's where I'm at. I don't want to running back taken until day 3. That's where I'm at.
Yeah, I like Simmons. I like him more as a safety though, than a linebacker. I feel like he's basically the same player that Keanu Neal is. So if you're drafting him,
I mean, he could do a little bit of everything. It's just a matter of I think at linebacker, we talked about Deion Jones being more of a fit at will linebacker, and the thing I'd add there is, with Quinn in this regime coming back, I don't think we'll ever see them make an adjustment there. I think he'll always be the Mike linebacker as long as Dan Quinn's there. But if you did add Isaiah Simmons into that room, you kind of have 2 linebackers that aren't great at, probably playing through the junk and getting off blocks and being good in the run game. You have 2 great coverage guys, which, again, I guess in today's NFL, you'd prefer that. But you kind of do have, more redundancy there. So I can certainly see why, shifting him to strong safety makes a little bit more sense. Because, again, he can do both of those things. It's just, is he a Mike linebacker? He's probably not. But I think this is going to be a huge year for Keanu Neal. I think it's make or break. They got him on that 1-year option. And they're gonna see if he's back to full health. And if not, then certainly strong safety is going to be a pressing need sooner rather than later, I guess.
Yeah.
Anything else in the chat?
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of stuff. Snacks Harrison is not a free agent. But he is a potential cap cut.
Yeah, and I guess he's contemplating retirement. He
Yeah,
had kind of an emotional post-game locker room speech.
yeah. And Cody's question about whether you think a team will release a decent pass rusher. We talked about Ryan Kerrigan. I think Olivier Vernon is a possibility as well. Michael Bennett, I think, is a strong possibility with Dallas as well. So I think there will be some options as far as veteran pass rushers this offseason. Yeah.
But it's almost always the veterans. Don't expect to get a 26, 27-year-old good pass rusher.
Yeah.
teams hold on to those guys.
As I said, you're looking for like Justin Houston this past year. I think would have been, a great kind of selection just to serve as a bridge to a future draft pick. And he certainly showed in Indianapolis he still has quite a bit in the tank. So that's why Ryan Kerrigan is going to be in that mold this year if he's a cap casualty. I think Robert Quinn, I don't think we brought up his name. He had a good bounce back year in Dallas, led the NFL and ESPN's pass rush win metric. We'll see how much money he gets. I think that Justin Houston contract is kind of going to be the market comp for these guys, probably adjusted for, cap increasing this year. That's kind of the market comp. So him and maybe Jason Pierre-Paul, who certainly showed this past Sunday that he still has some left in the tank, and it'll be interesting to see if he leaves Tampa Bay. So those are a few names, I think, in addition to the ones we've already mentioned that, Falcons fans should maybe have their eye on in free agency.
Stephen Weatherly is a name that Cody Stokes brings up, and he's, been a promising young guy for the Vikings at the end. So, I'll be curious to sort of see what his price tag will be, because I could see a team paying him like a starter because he's, sometimes, I think last year when Griffin was, dealing with his personal issues, Weatherly was pretty productive. I don't know what he's done so far this season. I think he's kind of fallen back to earth from what I last remember seeing. But, he's a guy that would be on the table. Another note from Matt Tate. Yes. So with Quinn coming back, how confident are you that Campbell will be back? I would be shocked at this point if Campbell comes back. I wouldn't, 3 months ago before the Falcons lost 6 straight games, I would have been like, I think he probably will come back. But I think at this point in time, like given, priorities, like I just, in knowing that Drew Rosenhaus is definitely going to give the Falcons a favorable deal. I won't say it's a 0% chance. Maybe they'll get Campbell at considerably cheaper than probably what he could get elsewhere, but I would be shocked at this point in time if he's brought back. But never say never with the Falcons.
Yeah.
I mean, no one this time last year, everybody was convinced that Vic Beasley was gone.
Yeah, that's what I was about to say. Is we didn't think Vic Beasley would be back. So
$13 million later.
Yeah.
Did you guys see the thing with Kenyon Barner?
I did,
yeah, not a great PR move.
Yeah. I do love it. I was saying this to somebody on Twitter today. It's like we as fans have this very strong passion. Like you are either a Falcon or you're a Saint. There is no sort of thing. And like players, like they don't care about this stuff. It's like, oh, the Saints could sign me to, like, if you're Kenyon Barner, like I could get a job with the Saints next year. Like I don't care about the rivalry or whatnot.
I mean, he's only been a Falcon 1 year, so I don't know if he understands and appreciates that rivalry as much as maybe a Matt Ryan does or Julio Jones does. But he was someone that, watching him on the mic'd up videos throughout the year, he had a much better personality than I ever would have expected. So I don't really have an issue with it. I mean, he's a fun guy. I understand why he said what he said as far as it gives him an opportunity to get that check, get that Pro Bowl that he's long been yearning for. So. And that's the thing about the Pro Bowl is, we kind of talked about it, Aaron, a couple of weeks ago when the roster came out. But, it's a popularity contest, and maybe the meaning behind it to fans and what it means for players' legacy has diminished. But to players, I don't think it's diminished at all. I mean, you saw how much Grady Jarrett wanted it throughout the year, and to see him finally get it. I mean, these players still want to go to this game. And you're seeing it now with Kenyon Barner with these comments. So, the Falcons fans out there, don't give the guy too much grief. I mean, he just wants to go to the Pro Bowl, and that's his path to getting there.
Yeah, pretty much. Oh, interesting. There you go.
Before he was damaged by Matt Bosher.
Yeah. That we'll blame it on CTE from the concussion that Matt Bosher gave him on the body slam. Vlad Tepes, how would you feel about taking a guy like Biadasz in round 2, put him at left guard, and then center when Mac hangs it up?
I mean, my question is he going to get to round 2? I feel like he's a round 1 player. And, is that good value at pick 16? DW brought up Thomas Dimitroff trading down, and his aversion to that. I'd certainly, if the D-line guys are all off the board, I'd certainly be in favor of trading down and then maybe in the 20s picking up, a guy like Beataz from Wisconsin. I'm not against, continuing this, all-in assault on the offensive line because, it's been long overdue. And we kind of saw a little bit of the fruits of that, at times this season with McGarry and Lindstrom. So, again, it's much better than, say, a running back or, another wide receiver. I certainly am okay with drafting a wide receiver a little bit later, but I don't know if we necessarily need to take a top skill player in round 1. But an offensive lineman in round 1, if it makes sense, I'd be okay with that.
Yeah. We talked about this a little bit last
week. I know
week.
you're not really in love with these guys in round 1.
Yeah, no, it's just because I haven't really watched them. So it's not this idea of I'm against the idea or it's just for me, if you're going to take a center that high, if you're going to take a center at 16, he's got to be the best center prospect you've seen in 3 to 5 years.
Yeah.
Because typically teams don't take centers in the first round. Now I know the last couple of drafts we've seen guys like
Travis Frederick
and Bradbury and Frank Ragnow and some of these guys, Billy Price, didn't necessarily work out for the Bengals. But you've seen some of these teams, invest in their interior offensive line. But I got to feel if I'm going to be happy about the Falcons drafting a center in round 1, knowing that guy's probably going to sit the bench his first year, maybe, again, as Vlad says, maybe he can come in and start right away at left guard. Certainly will have an opportunity to compete there. But if you're going to use a number 1 pick on a guy that's not really going to pay off until 2021 in terms of what you're drafting him for, you gotta convince me that dude is the truth. This team can't really afford to not have a first round pick come in right away and be that's a plug and play day 1 starter, like a Chris Lindstrom, like a Keanu Neal, etc. This team is not really in a position to afford those types of long-term building, because obviously this coaching staff is on a hot seat and you need to get impact players right away. So again, if I sit here and watch Biadasz or Creed Humphrey from Oklahoma, and I watched a little bit of him in the playoff game and I thought he was good, but I wasn't blown away by him by any means. I would have to watch these guys and be oh yeah, that guy's actually the truth. And I would be much more on board with that in terms of getting them on the field right away. But without that happening, I'm just not necessarily, I'd much rather get a more impactful player, day 1 potential starter, particularly on the defense side of the ball.
Yep.
I know DW, we're going deep in the draft. People have been chomping at the bit. Cody Stokes, who's better, Kinlaw or Epinesa?
I would take Epinesa. I've been likening him to everyone's favorite Saint, Cameron Jordan. I think he has that type of potential. I don't know if he's necessarily going to be available now at 16. I think Kinlaw is more likely to be there. And I do like Kinlaw. I did a mock draft last night, and that was the guy I ended up choosing in round 1 at 16. So I think that would be a fine choice. I think he's going to test out the gym, Johan Kinlaw from South Carolina. And, Chris Jones is the comps that he's been receiving, who's turned into a, Pro Bowl, All-Pro type of player. So if he can get close to that, that would be a great pick. And, Grady Jarrett can use a running mate. So getting an interior guy like that is certainly, a nice pick. Nice consolation, because it seems like they're going to be out of the Derek Brown sweepstakes because he's going to be a top 10 pick.
DW, you have any thoughts on any of these draft prospects?
I'm not a draft guy. I watch you guys for that content.
Okay. All right. Yeah, I'm similar mindset. I think, a lot of people have been building up, Chase Young being the most prominent one, Derek Brown being sort of, plan B. I know Epinesa is high on a lot of people's board. So, I think this notion that the Falcons can't find good players at 16, based off what I've seen, and again, I've only done, skimmed the surface as far as this draft goes, but I'm it's a pretty good D-line group. Kinlaw would be a great pick.
It did take a hit though today, though. I was surprised. Marvin Wilson, the guy from Florida State, who was likely going to be a top 40, top 45 pick, decided to go back to Florida State for his senior year. So that certainly hurts things. And, that was part of the reason that I think if you do want to get a D tackle, I think you kind of have to take one here in this round one, because the drop off isn't great. You're looking at maybe like a Neville Gallimore if he makes it to round 2, or, Raekwon Davis's stock has cooled off quite a bit, the Alabama D tackle. So I don't necessarily know the interior is great. Again, I'm just starting my homework on a lot of it. I've compiled a list of names, but I haven't necessarily watched them. But the early reaction for me is that the interior class isn't great, but there's quite a bit of edge guys throughout this class. So that's why you can maybe wait on day 1 for an edge and get someone on day 2. But yeah, Marvin Wilson news that kind of shook me a little bit. I didn't expect him to go back to school, but it worked out for Derek Brown, and likely Marvin Wilson will probably be high on the list of top 10 picks in 2021, or maybe top 15 at the very least.
Yeah. For me, I think looking at this draft class, and again, only skim the surface, but I feel like if the plan is to go best defensive player available, BDPA, we should get that started this offseason with hashtag. I feel like they'll have options at 16.
Yeah,
it may not be sort of this all world class pass rusher, that Ed Oliver or Derek Brown or Chase Young is going to be, or whatever people have had their hopes and dreams, centered on, and inevitably have the Falcons crush them. Which, from the life of me, I don't understand why you guys still do this to yourselves. The Falcons are going to ruin your hopes and dreams. Just set your expectations really low.
I'm certainly learning that year by year doing this. I'm certainly learning.
I just think they'll have some options, whether it's Simmons, whether it's Delpit, whether it's a corner, whether it's Kinlaw or something like that. Obviously we have a long way to go between now and the draft, but I feel like, anybody that's like whining about them not tanking and suddenly they're going to miss out on a good player, I just kind of like, I don't know if that's the case. Maybe they'll miss out on a great player, but like right now, I think the Falcons just need as many good players as they can possibly get. A great player would be awesome, but even Chase Young isn't changing. We're not sitting here, we're going to get Chase Young, and now we're going to go 12-4 next year.
Right.
They're still going to be basically like a 9-7 team, because Chase Young single-handedly can't necessarily, win you, 3 or 4 extra games. I mean, maybe he can. We'll find out. But so I think people chill out with the whole they didn't lose enough games and now they're screwed takes.
Yeah, I think recent NFL draft history has shown how many of the pass rushers who've been taken at number 1 have turned the franchises around that they were drafted by. I mean, what's the most recent one? Clowney? I mean, he's not even in Houston anymore.
I mean, I would say Nick Bosa, when Aaron said that. I mean, he's certainly changed the culture, and I apologize for kind of changing locations here. My power source is going to die on me, and I didn't plan this out better. But I would say Nick Bosa was one that turned that unit around. And I think Chase could potentially do that for a D-line, but, to the overall point,
it's never a guarantee is what I'm getting at.
Yeah. And I still think the Falcons could be a 9-7 team with Chase Young in the fold. So it's all about getting as many good players as you can. And certainly where the Falcons are at now, picking 16th in each round, that they can certainly get good value. I just, you're curious now with Thomas Dimitroff. We talked about trading down, but trading up's always on the table. I mean, they did it this past year with McGarry. I kind of hope, we have what we had in 2018 where they didn't really do that at all. I think they maybe did it on day 3, probably, right, with Foy Olakun and all that, or Russell Gage. But I don't think they're in a position where trading up is in the cards, and they're not one player away. They need as many cheap, affordable contracts as they can get.
Yep.
And they need as many bites at the apple, or, dart throws that they can get. So hopefully they sit tight, play the board, and, as Aaron said, BDPA in most cases. But I do think, as I said earlier, I would expect, 3 offensive picks just based on their history. They like to do the 50-50 even split. They don't like to have any side of the ball, not addressed. And there's certainly a few spots on offense where you can address, obviously, offensive line, but certainly, running back, potentially receiver. I like what Russell Gage brought, but I do think I'd rather have him at wide receiver 4. And I think maybe getting a wide receiver 3 in this deep class, I think that should be in play. But will it be in play? We'll find out in April.
They loved him from Russell Gage. And look, he certainly did some things that cause you to love him. But, I think you're right, Matt. Basically, you're saying, like,
I would even
good, but you can upgrade him.
I'd love him. Mm-hmm. More. See, I'd love him more if we didn't have Dirk Cutter calling the shots. Like, he could be used in a better fashion as a vertical threat. But because of the play caller we have, you can only like some of this talent so much. And
he just needs to stop jumping.
Yeah. Yeah, he's gonna get himself hurt. But
he got himself hurt.
He did get himself hurt a couple times this year.
Yeah.
But yeah, okay. Appreciate all you guys in the chat for giving your comments, and we can't get to all of them. We're creeping up on 2 hours when we were shooting for an hour, and I know DW's just sitting here like, I thought this was going to be an hour-long show. But we appreciate DW for joining us. You need to make another booze run.
Exactly.
He's sobering up as we speak. So DW, let everybody know that doesn't already where they can hit you up on Twitter and what some of the things you guys got going on over at the Falcoholic in the coming days and weeks.
Yeah, we're gonna have tons of content. We're gonna be looking at the Falcons over the past decade as we turn the corner into 2020. So you can expect a lot of content in that regard. Of course, you can find me on Twitter at FalcoholicDW right there, and the Falcoholic podcast. So we'll be getting back to that soon, and hopefully having you guys on there in the coming weeks if you're ready and willing to do that.
Absolutely.
I'm always ready to exact my revenge on the official Falcoholic podcast. So guys, we appreciate DW for joining us, and we always appreciate you guys for joining us and jumping in the chat and giving us some 40 minutes of extra content for the show. And we'll be back at some point. Matt and I will get together.
Take a break though, but break, but
we'll get together and sort of plan out what our off-season schedule is going to be. But certainly if we're not back on Pro Football Central's YouTube page, which you guys should definitely subscribe to, like this video, share it, and all that sort of stuff. You definitely want to go ahead to the Facebook page of Falcon Central Radio and like that page, because we will certainly be throwing up a lot of content on Facebook over the course of the offseason, not certainly hour and 45-minute episodes of podcasts, but certainly, 5, 10, 15-minute sort of segments if we just want to jump on and give our thoughts on various things. Of course, we'll be adding great content on Twitter at Falcons PFC. You, of course, can follow Matt and myself to get those updates on all the various things that we're going to be throwing up there, out here on the interwebs. I'm at FalcFans, FalcFans, and Matt is Matt Karoly, MattKaroly. Matt, anything you want to plug before we duck out?
Well, I probably should mention that, I talked about writing about the GMs. Well, obviously, there's no need to talk about the GMs in my next article or GM candidates. So I'll probably turn the page and look at free agency stuff, potential names, kind of the names we talked about here a little bit, or go in depth and find a couple more. So that'll be part 2 of Falcon Eye to the Future, and I'll probably get that closer to March, probably in February as we near free agency. So that'll be at riseupreader.com.
Absolutely. Guys, have a good night and have a happy new year. Hope 2020 and the Falcons bring a little bit more joy in your life in 2020 than they certainly did in 2019. So we will definitely see you guys around and enjoy the festivities tomorrow night. Appreciate you guys for tuning in for another great year of 2019. And we certainly hope to bring you some of the great content and better content in 2020. And again, DW, we appreciate you for joining the show tonight in closing out superb podcast year for 2019, not necessarily a superb football season for the Falcons.
Yep. Thanks, guys.
Thanks, DW.
Have a good one.